In the glittering cage of Manhattan's elite, Elise Sterling's life of luxury hides a dangerous truth. Married to billionaire Alexander Sterling, a man whose empire casts a shadow over her dreams, she's a bird yearning to fly. Enter Julian Voss, an architect with a disarming smile and secrets that could unravel everything. A stolen glance at a gala sparks a forbidden affair, but passion comes with a price. Whispers of betrayal and a shadowy underworld threaten to expose them all. As Elise clutches a USB drive holding secrets that could topple empires, she faces a choice: stay in her gilded prison or risk everything for freedom. But who's pulling the strings? Her ruthless husband, her desperate lover, or someone far more dangerous? A single bullet in a dark alley changes everything. Will Elise run, or will she fight? Dive into a world of wealth, deceit, and heart-stopping twists. One truth could set her free or destroy her. Find out in a tangled web of wealth and betrayal. The city skyline glittered like a diamond-encrusted crown, each spire a testament to ambition and excess. From the penthouse of the Sterling Tower, the world below seemed small, insignificant, a mere backdrop to the opulent life of Alexander Sterling and his wife, Elise. The narrator, James Caldwell, a private investigator with a penchant for unraveling the secrets of the elite, watched the couple from the shadows, his voice low and measured, recounting the unraveling of their gilded world. Alexander Sterling, a man in his late 50s, was the epitome of success. His empire, Sterling Enterprises, spanned tech, real estate, and finance, with a net worth in the tens of billions. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes commanded boardrooms, his charisma disarming even the most cynical investors. Yet, beneath the tailored suits and confident smiles, there was a coldness, a detachment that had grown over decades of relentless ambition. He was a man who owned everything, except perhaps the heart of his wife. Elise Sterling, 35, was a vision of elegance, her auburn hair cascading in soft waves, her emerald eyes holding secrets that flickered like candlelight. She was a former art curator, plucked from a modest gallery by Alexander's charm and promises of a life beyond imagination. Their marriage, now in its 8th year, was a spectacle of wealth, private jets, charity galas, and a mansion in the Hamptons. But the cracks were evident to those who looked closely. Elise's laughter at galas was forced, her smiles brittle. She moved through their world like a ghost, beautiful but untethered, yearning for something her husband's billions could not buy. James, hired by Alexander to monitor Elise after a tip from a loyal associate, observed her from a distance. His narration was tinged with sympathy, for he saw in Elise a woman trapped by her own choices. She was a bird in a golden cage, he murmured, and the cage was starting to suffocate her. The lover entered the scene like a storm cloud on a clear day. Julian Voss, a 38-year-old architect, was everything Alexander was not: warm, unassuming, with a disarming smile and calloused hands that spoke of creation rather than conquest. Julian's firm had been contracted to redesign the Sterling Foundation's new art wing, and it was at a planning meeting that he first met Elise. His dark eyes met hers across a table littered with blueprints, and something unspoken passed between them, a spark that would ignite a dangerous fire. Elise's internal conflict was a tempest. She loved the security Alexander provided, the way his name opened doors and silenced critics. But his affection had waned, replaced by late nights at the office and curt conversations. He treated her as an accessory, a trophy to be polished and displayed. Julian, by contrast, saw her. He listened to her speak of forgotten dreams, of the art she no longer curated, of the life she'd left behind. His touch, when it finally came, was gentle, exploratory, a stark contrast to Alexander's calculated embraces. James watched their affair unfold, his notebook filling with details: stolen glances at charity events, clandestine meetings in a Soho loft, whispered promises in the back of a cab. Elise was drowning in her own life, James narrated, and Julian was her lifeline. But lifelines can become nooses if you're not careful. The tension escalated at a gala in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The room was a sea of black ties and sequined gowns, champagne flutes clinking like wind chimes. Elise, in a sapphire gown that hugged her curves, stood beside Alexander, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Across the room, Julian lingered, his presence a silent challenge. Alexander, ever observant, noticed the way Elise's gaze drifted, the way her fingers tightened on his sleeve when Julian approached to discuss the art wing. "Mr. Sterling," Julian said, his voice smooth, "your wife has an impeccable eye for design. We're lucky to have her input." Alexander's smile was a blade. "She's quite the asset, isn't she?" Elise's cheeks flushed, and James, lurking near a marble statue, caught the exchange. The air was thick with unspoken threats, he noted. Alexander was no fool. He sensed the shift, the way Elise's loyalty was fraying. The affair grew reckless. Elise began slipping away during Alexander's overseas trips, meeting Julian in hotel rooms and quiet cafes. James followed, his camera capturing stolen kisses and lingering touches. But the risk was mounting. Alexander's associates whispered of his growing suspicion, his late-night calls to security firms. Elise, torn between guilt and desire, confided in Julian one rain-soaked evening. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If he finds out, he'll destroy us both." Julian pulled her close, his breath warm against her ear. "Then leave him, Elise. We can start over, anywhere." But leaving a man like Alexander Sterling was no simple task. His wealth was a fortress, his influence a web that ensnared anyone who dared defy him. Elise knew the consequences: public humiliation, financial ruin, perhaps worse. Yet Julian's promises were a siren's call, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The first twist came unexpectedly. James, tailing Elise to a Greenwich Village bookstore, overheard a conversation not meant for his ears. Julian wasn't just an architect. He had a past, a murky history of debts and questionable alliances. A man named Victor Crane, a loan shark with ties to organized crime, had leverage over Julian. "He's using her," James muttered, piecing together the puzzle. Julian's affection was genuine, but his desperation was a ticking bomb. Victor had demanded a cut of Sterling Enterprises' profits, and Julian was his unwitting pawn, seducing Elise to gain access to Alexander's inner circle. The revelation complicated everything. Elise was unaware of Julian's ties to Victor, believing his love was pure. James, torn between duty and empathy, debated whether to warn her. "She was a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing," he said, his voice heavy. The climax loomed at a charity auction in the Hamptons. The Sterling's estate was a vision of grandeur, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across the ballroom. Elise, radiant in ivory silk, moved through the crowd, her eyes searching for Julian. Alexander, distracted by a bidding war over a rare Picasso, didn't notice her slip away. James did. In a secluded garden, Elise and Julian met, their whispers urgent. "Victor knows about us," Julian confessed, his face pale. "He's threatening to tell Alexander unless I get him what he wants." Elise's breath caught. "What does he want?" "Access to Sterling's offshore accounts, blueprints, codes, anything." She shook her head, tears welling. "I can't betray him like that, Julian. I love you, but—" The words hung unfinished as James stepped from the shadows, his presence a jolt. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice steady, "you're in deeper than you know." Elise froze, her world collapsing. James revealed Julian's connection to Victor, the web of deceit tightening around them. "You've got two choices," James said. "Come clean to Alexander, or let Victor destroy you both." The confrontation that followed was electric. Elise, trembling, faced Alexander in his study, the Picasso now hanging on the wall like a silent witness. "I've been unfaithful," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But there's more you need to know." Alexander's face was a mask of rage and betrayal, but as Elise recounted Victor's scheme, his anger shifted. Julian, summoned to the estate, stood defiant, his love for Elise warring with his fear of Victor. "I never meant to hurt her," he said, his voice raw. "I thought I could protect her." Alexander's response was chilling. "You thought you could play me," he said, his eyes narrowing. You're not the first to try. The final twist came as Alexander revealed his own secret. He'd known about the affair for weeks, using James to gather evidence not just of Elise's betrayal, but of Julian's ties to Victor. Sterling Enterprises had been quietly dismantling Victor's network, and Julian was the bait. You thought you were the predator, Alexander said to Julian, but you were the prey. Elise, caught between her husband's ruthlessness and her lover's desperation, faced an impossible choice. Alexander offered her a deal: stay, play the loyal wife, and he'd protect her from Victor's wrath. Leave, and she'd face the consequences alone. Julian, meanwhile, pleaded for her to flee with him, promising a life free of Alexander's shadow, but at the cost of everything she knew. James, watching from the sidelines, saw the weight of her decision. She stood at a crossroads, he narrated, one path leading to safety and emptiness, the other to freedom and danger. Either way, she'd lose something irreplaceable. The story closed with Elise standing at the edge of the estate's cliffside, the ocean roaring below. She held a single photograph, one James had slipped her, a candid shot of her and Julian laughing in a moment of stolen joy. She tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter into the wind. Did she stay with Alexander, preserving her gilded cage? Did she run to Julian, risking everything for a chance at love? Or did she choose a third path, one neither man could predict? James's voice lingered, soft and haunting. Some secrets are too heavy to carry, too dangerous to reveal. Elise made her choice, but the truth? That's a story for another night. The wind howled off the Hamptons' cliffside, carrying the torn fragments of the photograph into the churning sea below. Elise Sterling stood motionless, her ivory silk gown rippling like a sail, her emerald eyes fixed on the horizon. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest, a vice of fear and defiance. James Caldwell, the narrator, lingered in the shadows of the estate's garden, his voice low and gravelly, weaving the next chapter of this tangled tale. She was no longer the woman who'd married Alexander, he murmured, but who she'd become, that was the question. Elise's mind was a battlefield, her thoughts clashing like swords. She loved Julian, or at least the version of him who'd made her feel alive again, his warm hands sketching dreams on her skin, his laughter a balm to her fractured soul. But Julian's betrayal, his entanglement with Victor Crane, had shattered that illusion. He'd been a pawn, yes, but a willing one, lured by the promise of freedom from his debts. And Alexander, her husband, her captor, had played them both with the precision of a chess grandmaster. His offer to protect her was no act of love. It was control, a leash disguised as mercy. The night of the confrontation in Alexander's study had left scars. After Julian's confession, Alexander had dismissed him with a chilling promise. Leave my wife alone, or Victor won't be your only problem. Julian had fled, his face a mask of shame and desperation, but not before whispering to Elise, "Find me if you change your mind. I'll wait." The words haunted her, a siren's call to a life she could barely imagine. James, ever the observer, noted the shift in Elise. She was unraveling, he said, but not breaking. There was steel beneath her fragility, a fire Alexander hadn't anticipated. He'd seen it in the way she'd faced her husband, her voice steady despite the tears. She'd laid bare her infidelity, but also Victor's scheme, forcing Alexander to confront a threat beyond their marriage. It was a gamble, one that had bought her time but not freedom. Days turned to weeks, and the Sterling household became a pressure cooker. Alexander, true to his word, launched a quiet war against Victor Crane. Sterling Enterprises' legal team, armed with James's evidence, began dismantling Victor's network, freezing assets and tipping off authorities. But Victor was no amateur. He retaliated with whispers of scandal, leaking rumors of Elise's affair to tabloid vultures. The headlines were vicious. Billionaire's wife in torrid affair with architect. Elise endured the scrutiny, her face a mask of composure at public events, but behind closed doors she was suffocating. Her internal conflict raged. Staying with Alexander meant safety, wealth, and a life of curated perfection, but at the cost of her soul. Leaving for Julian meant risking Victor's wrath, not to mention the uncertainty of a man who'd already betrayed her trust. And then there was the third option, the one that flickered in her mind like a forbidden flame, disappearing entirely, forging a new path alone. But Alexander's reach was long, his resources vast. Could she ever truly escape? The tension escalated at a winter gala in Manhattan, the city draped in snow like a glittering shroud. The event, hosted by Sterling Enterprises, was a display of power, with CEOs and senators mingling under chandeliers the size of small cars. Elise, in a crimson gown that turned heads, played her role flawlessly, her smile a weapon. But James, stationed near the bar, caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. Julian was there, uninvited, his presence a bold violation of Alexander's warning. "Trouble's brewing," James muttered, his instincts prickling. Julian approached Elise during a lull, his hand brushing hers as he leaned in to whisper. "Victor's closing in," he said, his voice urgent. "He knows Alexander's onto him. He's desperate, Elise. He'll hurt you to get to me." Elise's heart pounded, but she kept her composure, her lips barely moving. "What do you want me to do, Julian? I'm already drowning." "Run with me," he pleaded. "Tonight, I have a plan." Before she could respond, Alexander appeared, his presence a storm cloud. "Mr. Voss," he said, his voice smooth as ice, "you're a long way from your blueprints." The crowd around them stilled, sensing the undercurrent of menace. Julian excused himself, but not before slipping a note into Elise's hand, a burner phone number and a single word: midnight. James watched the exchange, his mind racing. Elise was at a breaking point, he narrated. One wrong move and the whole house of cards would collapse. He followed her as she slipped away from the gala, her heels clicking on the marble floor. In a quiet alcove, she dialed the number, her breath hitching as Julian answered. "I can't trust you," she said, her voice trembling. "Not after Victor. I'm not working for him anymore," Julian insisted. "I've cut ties. I have a contact in Montreal, someone who can get us new identities. We can start over, Elise, just you and me." The offer was a lifeline, but it came with a noose. Leaving meant abandoning everything: her name, her past, her safety. Staying meant enduring Alexander's control, his cold fury a constant reminder of her betrayal. James, eavesdropping from a shadowed corner, felt a pang of pity. She was a woman with no good choices, he said, only degrees of sacrifice. The climax came hours later, in the dead of night. Elise, unable to sleep, paced the penthouse, Alexander's snores echoing from their bedroom. The burner phone burned a hole in her pocket. At 11:55, she made her decision. Slipping into a black coat, she left the penthouse, her heart a drumbeat of fear and resolve. James, ever vigilant, followed, his narration taut with anticipation. This was it, he said. The moment everything would change. She met Julian in a deserted alley near the Hudson River, the city's pulse muted by the late hour. He was waiting in a nondescript sedan, his face drawn. "You came," he whispered, relief flooding his voice. But before Elise could climb into the car, headlights flared behind them. A black SUV screeched to a halt, and Victor Crane stepped out, his hulking frame flanked by two armed men. "Going somewhere," he sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "You didn't think I'd let you slip away, did you, Voss?" Elise froze, her breath catching. Julian stepped in front of her, his hands raised. "This isn't her fight, Victor. Let her go." Victor laughed, a cold, guttural sound. "She's the key to Sterling's vault. You think I'd let that go?" The standoff was electric, the air crackling with danger. James, hidden behind a dumpster, gripped his phone, ready to call for backup. But before he could act, another twist unraveled the scene. Alexander emerged from the shadows, his presence a shockwave. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the night. "Victor, you're done." What followed was chaos. Alexander's security team, tipped off by James's earlier reports, swarmed the alley, disarming Victor's men. But in the confusion, a shot rang out, a stray bullet from one of Victor's goons. Elise screamed as Julian staggered, blood blooming on his shirt. He collapsed, his eyes locking with hers. "Run," he gasped, before losing consciousness. Elise stood paralyzed, torn between the man she loved and the husband she feared. Alexander grabbed her arm, pulling her toward his car. "You're coming with me," he growled, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Pain, perhaps, or regret. James's voice was heavy as he narrated the aftermath. The alley was a graveyard of choices, each one bleeding out on the pavement. Julian was alive, but barely. Victor was in custody, his empire crumbling. And Elise? She was still a prisoner, whether she stayed or ran. The final twist came days later, as Elise sat in the penthouse, Alexander at a board meeting. A package arrived, unmarked, containing a single USB drive. On it was a video from Julian, recorded before the alley. His face was pale, his voice urgent. "Elise, if you're watching this, I'm either gone or in trouble. There's a safety deposit box in Montreal, under the name Elise Moreau. It's got everything you need. Money, passports, a new life. Alexander doesn't own you. No one does." The video ended and Elise's breath caught. Alexander had won the battle, but Julian had left her a key to freedom. She stood, her eyes drifting to the skyline, the city glittering like a promise or a trap. James's voice closed the tale, soft and haunting. She held the USB like a lifeline, but lifelines can burn if you hold them too long. Would she use it? Would she run? Or would she stay, playing the game until it consumed her? The penthouse was a mausoleum of silence, its marble floors and crystal chandeliers mocking Elise Sterling's turmoil. The USB drive sat on the glass coffee table, a small black rectangle that held the weight of a new life. Elise stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline sprawling before her, a glittering cage that had defined her for 8 years. James Caldwell, the narrator, watched from a distance, his voice a low rumble, threading through the tension like a needle through silk. "She was a woman on the edge," he said, "one step from freedom, one misstep from ruin." Elise's fingers trembled as she clutched the USB, Julian's words echoing in her mind. "Alexander doesn't own you. No one does." But ownership was a slippery thing in her world, woven into the contracts, the prenups, the unspoken debts of a life built on Alexander Sterling's billions. Julian was in a hospital bed, clinging to life after the alley shooting, his fate uncertain. Victor Crane was in custody, but his shadow lingered, a reminder of the chaos her choices had unleashed. And Alexander, her husband, her captor, was closer than ever, his eyes sharp with suspicion, his control tightening like a noose. Her internal conflict was a storm. Julian's love had rekindled her sense of self, but his ties to Victor had tainted that spark. Could she trust his promise of a new life in Montreal? Or was it another trap, a desperate man's gambit to keep her close? Staying with Alexander meant security, but at the cost of her soul. Every smile, every touch, a performance for a man who saw her as a possession. Leaving alone with the USB's contents was a leap into the unknown, a path where she'd have to rebuild herself from scratch. The idea thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. James, still on Alexander's payroll, had become an unwilling confidant. He'd delivered the USB to Elise, slipping it into her mailbox with a note. "Your move." His narration was tinged with unease. "I'd seen enough betrayals to know how they end," he said. "Blood, tears, or both." But Elise wasn't like the others. There was a fire in her, a defiance that could burn everything down. The tension ratcheted up as Alexander returned from his board meeting, his presence filling the penthouse like a storm cloud. He poured himself a scotch, his movements deliberate, and fixed Elise with a gaze that could cut glass. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "Something on your mind?" Elise's heart raced, the USB hidden in her pocket. "Just tired," she lied, her smile practiced. "The gala season's exhausting." He studied her, his blue eyes narrowing. "You've always been a terrible liar, Elise." He set the glass down, the clink echoing like a gunshot. "I know about the USB." Her breath caught, her mind scrambling. How? Had James betrayed her? Had Alexander's security team intercepted the package? She forced her voice to stay steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." Alexander stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. Don't play games with me. Voss left you a way out, didn't he? A little fantasy of running away together. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Did you think I wouldn't find out? The room spun. Elise's fingers brushed the USB, her lifeline, her noose. You've been watching me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. All this time. Always, he replied, his tone chilling. You're my wife, Elise, my investment. I protect what's mine. The confrontation was a tightrope. Elise could confess, beg for forgiveness, and hope Alexander's mercy outweighed his wrath. Or she could defy him, risk everything on Julian's promise. James, observing from a hidden vantage point, Alexander's paranoia had him monitoring the penthouse, felt the stakes rise. This was no longer a marriage, he narrated. It was a battlefield, and Elise was the prize. The first twist came like a thunderclap. As Alexander loomed over her, Elise's fear gave way to fury. I'm not your property, she snapped, her voice breaking the silence like glass. You don't love me, Alexander. You love the idea of me, the perfect wife on your arm. But I'm done pretending. His eyes widened, a flicker of surprise betraying his control. Careful, Elise, he warned. You don't know what you're throwing away. But she was past caring. She pulled the USB from her pocket, holding it like a weapon. This is my freedom, she said. Julian gave me a choice, something you never did. Alexander's laugh was cold, a sound that chilled James's blood. You think Voss is your savior? He's a dead man walking. Victor's men will finish what they started, and you'll be left with nothing. The revelation hit Elise like a blow. Julian, still alive, was in danger, not just from his injuries, but from Victor's wrath. Alexander had known, had let the threat linger to keep her in line. The betrayal was a double-edged sword, cutting through her trust in both men, but it also clarified her path. The climax erupted that night. Elise, driven by a mix of desperation and resolve, slipped out of the penthouse while Alexander slept, his scotch-fueled snores a temporary reprieve. She took nothing but the USB and a burner phone, her destination a hospital on the Lower East Side where Julian lay recovering. James followed, his narration taut with anticipation. She was running toward something, he said, or away from it, maybe both. At the hospital, Julian was a ghost of himself, pale and bandaged, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. You came, he whispered, his voice weak. I don't trust you. Elise cut in, her voice sharp. Not completely, but I trust Alexander less. She held up the USB. Tell me this is real. Tell me Montreal isn't a lie. Julian's gaze was steady, despite his pain. It's real. The box has everything. Passports, cash, a new name. I set it up before Victor got his hooks in me. It's yours, Elise, whether you take me with you or not. The moment was fragile, a thread stretched to breaking. But before Elise could respond, the hospital room door burst open. Victor's men, two shadows with guns, had tracked Julian down. Time's up, Voss, one growled. And you, Mrs. Sterling, are coming with us. James, lurking in the hallway, acted on instinct. He tackled the second man, a scuffle that sent nurses scattering. Elise grabbed a scalpel from a tray, her hand trembling but steady enough to slash at the first man's arm. Julian, despite his wounds, lunged from the bed, knocking the gun from the attacker's hand. The chaos was brief but brutal, ending with both men subdued, hospital security swarming in. Elise and Julian fled, slipping through a service exit into the night. James, bruised but alive, watched them go, his narration heavy with ambiguity. They were free for now, he said, but freedom's a fleeting thing when you're running from a man like Alexander. The final twist came weeks later in a Montreal cafe where Elise sat alone, her hair now blonde, her name now Elise Moreau. The safety deposit box had been real, passports, $50,000 in cash, a deed to a small apartment. Julian had vanished after the hospital, insisting she go alone, promising to find her once he was safe. But a letter arrived, postmarked from Paris, with no return address. Julian's handwriting was unmistakable. I'm alive. I'm sorry. Don't look for me. Elise stared at the letter, her heart a tangle of relief and loss. Had Julian betrayed her again, or saved her by letting her go? And Alexander, had he let her slip away, or was he biding his time, his long reach waiting to pull her back? James's voice closed the tale, soft and haunting. She was free, but freedom comes with ghosts. Elise had her new life, but the past is a shadow that never fades. Would she run forever, or would she turn and face it? The Montreal Café was a quiet refuge, its wooden tables scarred with stories, the air thick with the scent of espresso and fresh croissants. Elise Moreau, as she now called herself, sat by the window, her blonde hair tucked under a beret, her eyes scanning the street for threats that never came. The letter from Julian, its edges worn from rereading, lay folded in her purse, a relic of a life she'd barely escaped. James Caldwell, the narrator, watched her from a distance, his voice a low murmur weaving through the city's pulse. She'd traded one cage for another, he said, but this one was of her own making. Freedom, she was learning, was a fragile thing. Elise's new life in Montreal was a delicate balance, a tightrope strung between anonymity and paranoia. The safety deposit box had delivered as Julian promised. $50,000 in cash, a passport with her new name, and a deed to a modest apartment overlooking the St. Lawrence River. It was enough to start over, but not enough to erase the past. Alexander Sterling's shadow loomed large, his silence more unsettling than any pursuit. Had he let her go, or was he playing a longer game, waiting for her to slip? Her internal conflict was a constant hum. She'd left behind the gilded prison of her marriage, the suffocating weight of Alexander's control, but Julian's absence gnawed at her. His letter, "I'm alive. I'm sorry. Don't look for me," was both a lifeline and a wound. Had he abandoned her to protect her, or because his own survival demanded it? The memory of his touch, his whispered promises in stolen moments, clashed with the betrayal of his ties to Victor Crane. She wanted to hate him, but her heart refused to let go. James, no longer on Alexander's payroll, had followed Elise to Montreal out of a mix of curiosity and guilt. He'd been complicit in her unraveling, his surveillance feeding Alexander's paranoia. Now, untethered from his client, he watched her from afar, a ghost in her new life. She was rebuilding, he narrated, but the pieces didn't fit the same way. Every step forward was a glance over her shoulder. The tension escalated when a stranger appeared at the cafe. He was unremarkable, mid-40s, graying hair, a cheap suit. But his eyes lingered on Elise too long. She noticed, her pulse quickening, and slipped a hand into her purse, gripping the pepper spray she'd bought her first week in Montreal. The man approached, his smile disarming but not quite genuine. "Elise Moreau?" he asked, his voice smooth. She froze, her new name sounding foreign on his lips. "You've got the wrong person," she said. Her tone clipped, but her heart was a drumbeat. He slid a business card across the table. "My employer would like a word. He's persistent." The card bore a single name, Vincent Moretti. No title, no company, just a phone number. Elise's mind raced. Moretti wasn't Victor Crane, but the name carried the same weight, a shadow from the underworld Julian had tangled with. James, seated at a corner table, caught the exchange. "Trouble had a way of finding her," he murmured. She'd run from one predator, only to stumble into another's den. He followed the man as he left, noting his license plate, his gait, the way he scanned the street. A quick call to an old contact confirmed Moretti's identity. A fixer, a middleman for hire, often used by men like Alexander to clean up messes or create them. Elise's next move was reckless, driven by a need to reclaim control. She dialed the number on the card, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "What do you want?" she demanded when Moretti answered. "A meeting," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "My client has an interest in your situation. Tomorrow, noon, Parc La Fontaine. Come alone." The call ended, and Elise's world tilted. Was this Alexander, tightening the noose? Or someone new, exploiting her vulnerability? She considered running again. Vancouver maybe, or somewhere farther. But the thought exhausted her. She was tired of being prey. The meeting at Parc La Fontaine was a study in tension. The park was alive with spring, cherry blossoms drifting like pink snow. But Elise felt only the chill of exposure. Moretti sat on a bench, his suit replaced by casual slacks and a sweater, blending seamlessly with the joggers and dog walkers. "You're punctual," he said as she approached. "Good. My client appreciates efficiency." "Who is he?" Elise asked, her voice low, her eyes scanning for threats. Moretti's smile was cryptic. "Someone who knows your husband, someone who wants what he has." The first twist came like a blade. Moretti slid a tablet across the bench, its screen displaying a grainy photo. Alexander, shaking hands with a man Elise didn't recognize, in what looked like a private club. "Your husband's been making deals," Moretti said. "Offshore accounts, shell companies, all tied to a cartel. He's not as clean as he seems." Elise's breath caught. Alexander's empire was built on ambition, but she'd never suspected this. Was Moretti's client a rival, looking to topple Sterling Enterprises? Or was this a trap, bait to lure her back into Alexander's orbit? "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Information," Moretti said. "You lived with him for 8 years. You know his habits, his weaknesses. Help us, and we'll make sure you're protected." The offer was a poisoned apple. Betray Alexander, and she'd be diving deeper into a world of sharks. Refuse, and Moretti's client, whoever he was, might turn on her. James, watching from a nearby tree line, saw the trap closing. She was cornered, he narrated, a pawn in a game bigger than she'd ever imagined. The climax erupted that night in her apartment. Elise, unable to sleep, pored over the USB's contents, finding encrypted files she hadn't noticed before. A password, Moreau, unlocked them, revealing documents Julian hadn't mentioned. Bank records, emails, proof of Alexander's dealings with the cartel Moretti had referenced. Julian had known, had been gathering leverage before Victor's men caught up to him. Was this why he'd told her not to look for him? To keep her safe from this truth? A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. She grabbed a kitchen knife, her heart pounding, and opened it to find James, his face grim. "You're in over your head," he said, stepping inside. "Moretti's client isn't after Alexander. They're after you." The second twist was a gut punch. James revealed what his contacts had uncovered. Moretti worked for a woman named Claudia Reyes, a cartel heiress whose family Alexander had double-crossed in a deal gone sour. Claudia didn't want Elise's information. She wanted Elise as leverage, a bargaining chip to force Alexander's hand. The business card, the meeting, the tablet. It was all a setup to confirm Elise's location. "They know you're here," James said. "You've got hours, maybe less." Elise's mind raced. Run again? Confront Claudia? Or, impossibly, turn to Alexander, the man she'd fled. The knife trembled in her hand, a symbol of her dwindling options. "Why are you helping me?" she asked James, her voice raw. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe I'm tired of watching people like you get crushed by people like him." The escape was frantic. Elise packed a backpack, cash, passport, the USB, and followed James to a car he'd stashed nearby. They drove north toward Quebec City, the night swallowing them. But the road wasn't empty. Headlights trailed them, steady and unrelenting. James's voice was tight. "They're faster than I thought." The chase was a blur of adrenaline, tires screeching on wet pavement, the car weaving through rural roads. Elise clutched the USB, her lifeline, her curse. The pursuers, Claudia's men, James confirmed, closed in, their SUV ramming the back of the car. James swerved, but the road was narrow, the river looming to their left. The final twist came as the car skidded to a stop, a bridge ahead blocked by another vehicle. A figure stepped out, illuminated by headlights. Julian, alive, his face bruised but resolute. "Get out!" he shouted, a gun in his hand, aimed at the pursuing SUV. "Elise, now!" She stumbled from the car, her mind reeling. Julian fired, shattering the SUV's windshield, buying them seconds. "I didn't abandon you," he said, grabbing her arm. "I've been tracking Claudia's network. The USB. It's enough to bring them all down, Alexander included." The standoff was chaos. Claudia's men returned fire, James diving for cover, Elise caught between the men who'd shaped her fate. Julian's plan was desperate. Use the USB's evidence to expose the cartel and Alexander, forcing them to turn on each other. But it meant trusting him, a man who'd lied before. As bullets flew, Elise made her choice. She bolted for the bridge, the USB in her pocket, leaving Julian and James to hold the line. The river roared below, a dark promise of escape. James's voice, distant now, closed the tale. She ran, not for love, not for safety, but for herself. The USB was her weapon, her truth. But truth is a dangerous thing. It burns bridges, topples empires. Where would she go? Who would she become? The Quebec night was a shroud, the St. Lawrence River a black ribbon glinting under a sliver of moon. Elise Moreau sprinted across the bridge, her breath ragged, the USB drive a burning weight in her pocket. Behind her, gunfire cracked like thunder, Julian and James holding off Claudia Reyes's men in a desperate stand. The narrator, James Caldwell, his voice a low, urgent thread, wove through the chaos. She wasn't running from them, he said. Not anymore. She was running toward something. Herself, maybe, or a truth she couldn't yet name. Elise's heart pounded, her legs burning as she reached the far side of the bridge. The lights of Quebec City flickered in the distance, a beacon of safety or a mirage. The USB held secrets that could topple empires. Alexander Sterling's cartel dealings, Claudia's network, Julian's desperate bid for redemption. But it was also a target painted on her back. Every step she took was a gamble. Every choice a razor's edge between survival and annihilation. Her internal conflict was a furnace. Julian's reappearance had shattered her fragile trust. His gun and his promises, a reminder of the chaos he'd dragged her into. Yet his sacrifice, facing Claudia's men to buy her time, stirred something in her, a flicker of the love she'd tried to bury. Alexander, her husband, was a specter she couldn't outrun. His billions and his ruthlessness a net that could close around her at any moment. And Claudia, the unseen predator, wanted Elise as a pawn in a game she barely understood. The only certainty was the USB, its encrypted files a map to either freedom or destruction. James, battered but alive, had glimpsed Elise's flight from the bridge. His narration was heavy with the weight of his own choices. I'd been a cog in Alexander's machine, he said. Watching, reporting, enabling. Helping Elise was my penance, but it came with a cost. She was alone now, and the world she'd stumbled into didn't forgive. The tension surged as Elise reached the city's outskirts, ducking into an alley behind a shuttered patisserie. Her blonde hair, damp with sweat, clung to her face, the beret long lost in the chaos. She pulled the burner phone from her backpack, its battery nearly dead, and dialed the only number she trusted. A hacker contact Julian had mentioned in Montreal, a woman named Sophie who could crack the USB's remaining files. I need help, Elise whispered when Sophie answered, her voice trembling. I have something people will kill for. Sophie's voice was calm, clipped. Meet me at the old port near the silos, 1 hour, don't be late. Elise had no choice but to trust her. She moved through the city, her senses heightened, every shadow a potential threat. Claudia's men were relentless, their SUV prowling the streets, and Alexander's reach was a specter she couldn't shake. Had he tracked her to Quebec? Was he behind Claudia's pursuit, pulling strings from his Manhattan throne? The first twist came at the old port, where Sophie waited under a rusted lamppost, her hoodie obscuring her face. She was younger than Elise expected, barely 30, with sharp eyes and a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Show me, Sophie said, wasting no time. Elise handed over the USB, her hands shaking. Sophie plugged it into her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. This is heavy, she muttered as files decrypted. Bank transfers, encrypted emails, a ledger linking Alexander to Claudia's cartel through a web of shell companies. You've got a death wish carrying this. But the real shock was a hidden file, one Julian hadn't mentioned. It was a video, grainy but clear enough. Alexander, in a private jet, speaking to a man with Claudia's eyes, her brother perhaps. The wife's expendable, Alexander said, his voice cold. If she becomes a liability, handle it. The date stamp was 6 months ago, before Elise's affair with Julian had begun. Elise's breath stopped. Alexander hadn't just known about her betrayal. He'd planned for it, maybe even orchestrated it to justify eliminating her. Julian's involvement, Victor's threats, all of it could be Alexander's design. A chessboard where she was the pawn to be sacrificed. "He wanted me gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. Sophie's eyes softened, but her tone was urgent. "You can't stay here. This goes public and you're a target for everyone. Cartel, feds, your husband's goons. I can get you out, but it's now or never." The climax erupted as headlights flared at the port's edge. Claudia's men had found them, their SUV screeching to a stop. Sophie grabbed her laptop, pulling Elise toward a docked fishing boat. "Move!" she hissed. Gunfire erupted, bullets pinging off metal silos. Elise's legs burned as she ran, the USB back in her pocket, Sophie's hand gripping hers. They scrambled onto the boat, Sophie hot-wiring the engine as shouts echoed behind them. The boat roared to life, cutting through the river's dark waters. Elise clung to the rail, her mind reeling. Alexander's betrayal was a wound deeper than Julian's, a confirmation that her marriage had been a lie from the start. But the river wasn't safe. Another boat, sleek and fast, pursued them, Claudia's men relentless. Sophie steered with grim determination, dodging obstacles, but the gap was closing. The second twist came as a voice crackled over a radio on the boat. It was James, alive, his tone strained. "Elise, listen. Julian's with me. We're on your tail, but you've got to trust us." He'd survived the bridge, dragging a wounded Julian to safety, and they'd commandeered a boat to follow her. "Claudia's not the only one after you. Alexander's got a team inbound. You've got minutes." Elise's heart lurched. Julian, still fighting for her, despite everything. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "What do I do?" she shouted into the radio, the wind whipping her words. "Head for the border," James said. "There's a safe house in Maine, coordinates on the USB. Sophie knows the way." The chase was a nightmare, the river a gauntlet of speed and danger. Claudia's boat gained, a spotlight blinding Elise as shots rang out. Sophie swore, swerving, but a bullet grazed her arm, blood blooming on her sleeve. Elise took the wheel, her hands shaking but steady, steering toward the border as Sophie slumped, still conscious but fading. The final twist was a beacon in the dark. As the border loomed, a Coast Guard cutter appeared, its lights slicing through the night. James had called in a favor, an old contact from his PI days. The cutter intercepted Claudia's boat, forcing it to retreat, but not before a final shot shattered the fishing boat's windshield. Elise ducked, glass raining around her, and pushed the throttle to its limit. They reached the main shore at dawn, Sophie patched up by a safe house medic, the USB's coordinates leading them to a cabin hidden in the pines. Julian and James arrived hours later, Julian's wounds bandaged, but his eyes haunted. "I didn't know about Alexander's plan," he said, his voice raw. "I swear, Elise, I loved you." She wanted to believe him, but the video lingered, a scar on her trust. "You gave me a way out," she said, her voice steady. "That's enough for now." James's narration closed the chapter, heavy with uncertainty. She'd escaped, but the USB was a Pandora's box. Expose Alexander and she'd spark a war. Cartel, feds, Sterling Enterprises, all colliding. Keep it hidden, and she'd live in the shadows, always looking back. Elise held the truth, but truth is a blade that cuts both ways. What would she choose? The main cabin was a sanctuary carved from pine and silence, its walls weathered but sturdy, a bulwark against the chaos Elise Moreau had fled. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of gold and gray, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth and salt from the nearby coast. Elise stood at the cabin's window, the USB drive clutched in her hand, its weight heavier than the $50,000 or the passport it had delivered. Julian Voss sat on a sagging couch, his bandages fresh, but his eyes shadowed with pain and guilt. Sophie, the hacker, nursed her wounded arm, her laptop humming with the decrypted files that could unravel empires. James Caldwell, the narrator, leaned against the doorframe, his voice a low, steady pulse weaving the final threads of Elise's story. "She'd outrun the wolves," he said, but the forest was still dark, and the path ahead was hers to carve. Elise's internal conflict was a crucible, forging her into someone new. The USB held proof of Alexander Sterling's betrayal, not just of her, but of the law, his empire tied to a cartel through a web of offshore accounts and dirty deals. The video, Alexander's cold dismissal of her as expendable, had shattered the last illusion of their marriage. Yet Julian's role in her escape was a tangled knot of love and deceit. He'd given her the tools to flee, but his ties to Victor Crane and his secrets about the USB's contents had eroded her trust. Sophie, a stranger-turned-ally, offered clarity but no loyalty. She'd cracked the files, but her price was steep, half the cash from the safety deposit box. And James, the man who'd shadowed her life, was an enigma, his help a debt she didn't know how to repay. The cabin was a pause, not a resolution. Claudia Reyes's men were scattered, the Coast Guard's intervention buying time, but Alexander's reach was a specter that haunted every decision. Would he hunt her, his pride wounded by her escape? Or would he let her go, content to protect his empire from the USB's secrets? Elise's choice was simple but brutal. Expose Alexander and the cartel, risking a war that could consume her, or disappear deeper into the shadows, a ghost with a new name but no peace. James watched her, his narration heavy with the weight of endings. She wasn't the woman who'd married a billionaire, he said. She wasn't even the woman who'd loved Julian. She was something else now, raw, unformed, a spark waiting to ignite or burn out. The tension peaked as Sophie decrypted the final file, a ledger detailing Alexander's payments to Claudia's cartel, millions funneled through a shell company called Elysium Holdings. But the real shock was a name buried in the transactions: James Caldwell. "You're in here," Sophie said, her voice sharp as she turned the laptop toward him. "A wire transfer, 50,000, marked consulting. Care to explain?" Elise's breath caught, her eyes locking on James. He stiffened, his face a mask of conflict. "It was before I knew you," he said, his voice low. "Alexander hired me to dig into the cartel, not just you. I didn't know what he was planning." The first twist was a betrayal that cut deep. James, her reluctant savior, had been complicit in Alexander's schemes, a pawn in the same game that had trapped her. Elise's hand tightened on the USB, her voice cold. "You led me here. Was this part of his plan too?" James shook his head, his eyes pleading. "I stayed because I saw what he was doing to you. I helped you run, Elise. That wasn't in his script." Julian, silent until now, stood, his wound slowing him, but not his anger. "You used her," he spat. "Just like me, just like him." The air crackled, trust fracturing. Sophie, ever pragmatic, broke the silence. "We don't have time for this. Claudia's men will regroup, and Alexander's not far behind. This," she tapped the laptop, "is your leverage. Use it, or it uses you." The climax was a collision of choices. Elise paced the cabin, the USB a burning coal in her hand. Exposing Alexander meant contacting the feds, risking her own exposure as Elise Sterling, the runaway wife. Staying silent meant running forever, always looking back. And Julian, could she leave him behind, his love a tether she couldn't quite cut? James's betrayal, though softened by his actions, was a reminder no one was clean in this game. She made her decision at dusk, the sky bleeding red over the pines. "Sophie," she said, her voice steady, "send the files to the FBI, anonymously, every email, every ledger. Let Alexander and Claudia tear each other apart." Sophie nodded, her fingers already working. "It'll take time to route it through proxies, but once it's out, there's no going back." Julian stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "Come with me," he said, his voice raw. "We can disappear, start over, no more running." Elise looked at him, her heart twisting. "You gave me this," she said, holding up the USB. "But you also lied. I can't build a life on that." James watched, silent, as Elise turned to him. "You're not innocent either," she said. "But you got me here. That's something." The final twist came as Sophie uploaded the files, a message pinging on her laptop, a reply from an unknown source, encrypted but chilling. "Elysium Holdings is watching. You can't hide." Alexander had known, had anticipated her move. The cabin, the USB, her escape. It was all part of his game, a test to see how far she'd go. Or was it Claudia, her cartel's reach longer than Elise had feared? The files went live, a digital bomb detonating across servers. Within hours, news broke. Sterling Enterprises implicated in cartel scandal. Alexander's face was everywhere, his empire crumbling under federal scrutiny. Claudia's cartel, named in the leaks, faced raids across 3 continents. Elise, Sophie, Julian, and James scattered. Sophie to a hacker commune in Berlin, Julian to an unknown destination, James back to the shadows of his trade. Elise stood alone on a rocky Maine beach, the USB now empty, its secrets spent. She was Elise Moreau. But who was that? A woman with no past, no ties, only the horizon ahead. James's voice, distant now, closed the tale. She'd burned the bridges, toppled the kings. But freedom isn't a place, it's a choice, made every day. Elise walked into the unknown, her shadow her own. Where would she go? What would she become? That's a story only she could write.